What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Riot loves to release unique and interesting champions, and a new character coming out is a really cool piece of content that League gets from time to time. But every now and then, the champ is just a bit too crazy and results in a ridiculous release that leave people wondering what the hell was Riot thinking. As we count down the list, we'll be measuring these champions by how overpowered they were on release and how hard they got nerfed right after. We'll only be looking at releases from Season 1 onwards, as the beta stuff is a little bit too crazy to judge. Let's get started. Number 10 is Echo. With Echo's release, we saw what was one of the most overloaded kits League of Legends has ever seen, and although this AP assassin was quite difficult to play, his utility and power proved to be unmatched in the hands of a skilled Echo player. His ridiculously low mana costs, high base damages and stats, as well as insane utility led to him having a crazy release. With his stun and ultimate being super difficult to see and predict at the time, even players at the highest level had a super hard time dealing with him, and his outplay potential was crazy high, while opponents were left with little options to punish the mistakes an Echo player might happen to make, since the tools in his kit were super forgiving. Number 9 is Jinx. On release, the damage Jinx's abilities would deal, as well as the attack speed steroid she had from her minigun, were totally absurd. She came out and completely dominated the hypercarry role, and the tools she had in her kit allowed her to be a complete lane bully. Most hypercarries have a very weak laning phase, and that's why they don't succeed in a meta dominated by tanks, but Jinx totally crushed that, with the poke from a W max being super powerful and caused laning against her to be a total nightmare. Even after getting nerfed in about 4 or 5 patches, she is still one of the strongest hypercarries in the game with the amount of utility her kit brings to a teamfight. Having area of effect damage that can crit on auto attacks is a really powerful tool for any AD carry to have, and combined with the rest of the power she had on release, we were left with a champion who reminded us of the glory days of Season 2 AD carries who wrecked the meta entirely. Number 8 is Graves. Speaking of the glory days of AD carries, when Graves was released in Season 2, his base levels of power were absolutely ridiculous, and the utility his smokescreen provided was a really unique tool that set Graves a significant level above everyone else. His release alone caused hypercarries to completely fall out of the meta in favor of the trinity of Graves, Ezreal, and Corki, the lane dominant AD carries, since there's no reason to play a hypercarry at all if you could just play Graves and almost match up to the late game damage output, but completely destroy the laning phase. Since Graves was an AD carry that totally wrecked the laning phase, but also had a ton of damage in the late game, there was pretty much no way, and certainly no reason, to get away with playing an AD carry who was weak during the laning phase. He received nothing but nerfs for about 2 years following his release, and even when he fell out of the meta, we saw him pop up as a strong laning phase bully here and there. Number 7 is Vayne. Rounding out the last AD carry on our list, when Vayne was released in early Season 1, she was essentially a Superman version of the Vayne we see today. She had significantly higher damage on all of her abilities, Q, W, E, and even on the AD steroid of her ultimate. She also had a higher attack range, much more base stats, and much more movement speed, as well as the stealth on her ultimate lasted for a full 1.5 seconds. With a tumble max at level 9, she could proc the 1.5 second stealth every 2 seconds during the 8 to 12 second duration of her ultimate as it ranked up, and with her abilities pumping out a lot more damage, the early game weakness of Vayne was completely non-existent. The long-lasting stealth made her weaknesses in teamfights as well almost impossible to punish, and we were left with an insanely powerful AD carry with loads of outplay potential who was super powerful inherently. Number 6 is RexI. The damage values and ratios on RexI when she first came out, combined with the incredible utility of her passive and awesome crowd control she brought to the table, along with the overpowered warrior jungle enchant, all came together to make her kit really powerful throughout all phases of the game. She was everything you wanted from a jungler: really strong clears, a very strong early game, great sustain, area of effect crowd control, and the vision during her burrow completely wrecked the jungle meta, and she was one of the main forces that suppressed tank junglers until Cinderhulk came into the game. She single-handedly ruined the jungle meta in the eyes of most pro players, as it was very tough to match up to her strength if picked in a game, and the utility of her burrow and strength as a jungler inherently eliminated a large amount of weaknesses entirely from a lot of team compositions. Her win rate was insane, as despite her overloaded kit, she wasn't too complex to play, and so she peaked out at around a 56% win rate or so, and she's still one of the best junglers in the game to this day. Number 5 is Kassadin. And okay, I know I said no champions from beta earlier, but I kind of just have to include Kassadin because his release was so memorable, and it only happened about a month or so before beta was over, so in my eyes, it's close enough. This one is a little bit tricky. On release, Kassadin wasn't perceived to be as obscenely overpowered as some of the other champions on this list, and it took a little bit of time for people to actually realize how powerful he was. However, release Kassadin was the strongest version of Kassadin that has ever existed, and he certainly was overpowered when released, as shown by the slightly minor nerfs he received for continuous patches following it. Many people will remember the old Kassadin who had a targeted silence on his Q, as well as some nice mana restoration on his W, but when Kassadin was released, his W would actually steal mana from its target. He also had crazy high AP ratios and base scaling, as well as much lower mana costs on everything, especially his ultimate, and his Force Pulse had a 1.0 AP ratio and only required 4 abilities instead of 6 to get charged up. He also had some MR per level and higher armor per level, and really so many other little things that I could go on and on about, that even after receiving about a dozen nerfs, he still became a crazy powerful champion for such a long time, and was a true nightmare if you ever played back then. Although he might not have been perceived to be as insane as some of the others, he definitely was ridiculous, and he was still seen as significantly overpowered at the time either way. Number 4 is Diana. On release, the tuning of Diana's kit was actually off the wall insane. Her ultimate had a range of 900, and her base damage and ratios were all much higher. Additionally, the range on her Moonfall was larger, so her crowd control was much better, making her combos a lot easier to pull off, and her damage overall to be quite ridiculous. Her crazy damage values and scaling allowed her to play a tanky bruiser style with the damage of an assassin burst mage with incredible range in her abilities, leaving her without much counterplay and making laning against her a total nightmare. Froggen once played Diana in a tournament a week after her release, legitimately having played her only once the day she came out, and he still completely wrecked that game and went on to win the tournament. Release Diana would go on to receive one of the biggest nerfs of all time, resulting in her falling out of the meta for a while, but those who played during the release of the champion will remember how much of a terror Diana was in the games that she was picked. Number 3 is Zyra. With Zyra's release, she instantly proved to be an insane mage, as her raw damage output, comboed with the utility of her kit, was just absurd. The ranges and hitboxes on her skill shots were totally crazy, as were the missile speeds, causing all of her skills to not only have super high damage, but also be really easy to land and combo. Since her abilities hit through creeps, it caused her laning phase to be super powerful and impossible for any other champion to match up to. She had a 58% win rate on release, and was so powerful that it resulted in a hotfix that gave her a huge nerf after about a week or so, one of the few times Riot has hotfixed a champion due to them simply being so damn overpowered. Even after the hotfix and multiple nerfs, she was played competitively on both mid lane and on support, and has seen loads of success off the back of the power of her kit on launch. Number 2 is LeBlanc. Back then, LeBlanc still had a silence on her Q, but had also much higher ranges, super high damage, and mana costs that were so low they might as well have been non-existent. The damage amplification on her ultimate was also higher, causing her burst damage combos to be super easy to one-shot people with, even if you were really far behind in a game, and if she was ahead, I'm sure you can imagine the possibilities. This burst damage assassin on release was so broken that she resulted in a hotfix nerf only 2 days after her release for a huge gutting of her her kit that still left her completely broken as hell. Eventually, even after receiving multiple, even dozens of nerfs and losing her silence, LeBlanc still remained a really powerful champion. The Burst Mage Assassin playstyle is one that's proven to be really strong, and I think LeBlanc's release was the first time a champion had ever been hotfixed for balance reasons. It set the precedent and showed that when a champion was that overpowered, Riot would finally be willing to hotfix them. And number 1 is Xin Zhao. Apart from being one of the most overpowered champions in the history of the game and having a 59% win rate on release, Xin Zhao was at a time when Riot didn't hotfix champions for being too overpowered, so players had to endure the terror of this guy for a full 2 weeks until patch day. He had massive base scaling, shorter cooldowns, higher ranges, and a lot more damage overall, meaning you could jump into a team, ult a target, and then focus them down quickly to come out ahead in something as crazy as a 1v5 scenario. His abilities were gutted in the next patch when he received a humongous nerf, but it really didn't matter at all since he was just that broken on release. There's a somewhat famous video where Hotshot GG gets a pentakill in high elo in what's basically a 1v5, showcasing the ridiculousness of the champion. Even though he was immediately nerfed, he was still a crazy monster for quite some time, and is notorious for being the biggest mistake in releases Riot has ever made to this day. This set the precedent for them to be a lot more careful with releasing champions over the years, and takes my number 1 spot as the most overpowered release in League of Legends history.
Symptomatic fecal flaws due to twisting gut eclipsing bats and forth and it's time I know it takes a mighty dose of faith, but keep in mind we just skip the ship well far